My name is Dipesh Chakrabarty, and I teach history and about South Asia, South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago. Subaltern studies literally means studying the history and the culture and the politics of people who are socially subordinated. So we took the expression from the Italian um, Marxist leader who died in Mussolini's prison, Antonio Gramsci, who used to talk about subaltern classes, the study of socially subordinated, disadvantaged, powerless people. Postcolonial theory emerged at the same time as subaltern studies in the 1980s, mainly in the Western democracies, in the United Kingdom, in the US, in Australia, Canada, in the Anglo sphere. But eventually there was a French version of it too, and also a German version, an Italian version later on. But it really was the attempt to understand the empire and the colony after they were gone. It was very influenced by um, a lot of intellectual movements in the West. So obviously, it has its basis in some kind of traditions of the left, Marxist and non Marxist. But it was also very influenced by all the theoretical fallout of May 68. Foucault and Lacan and Derrida, Deleuze and Guattari, all those people became sort of patron saints of postcolonial theorizing. So, after the modern environmentalist movement came about in the 1970s, I mean, obviously the environmental consciousness goes back, but we think of modern environmental movement happening from the 1970s on, and then people began to make a distinction between environmentalism of the rich and the environmentalism of the poor. Like people saw American national parks as one model of environment, which is environmental protection, protecting the environment, but it's planned by government, by scientists, by experts. On the other hand, there was the model of a movement like the Chipko movement in India, where basically peasant women uh, hugged trees to stop timber companies from cutting them, right? And that was seen as a more agitational environmentalism of poor people who did not have access to normal kinds of power. But environment belongs to everybody. And where I think postcolonial theory and subaltern studies contribute in particular is the question of how to combine the spirit of democratic participative politics with that of protecting the environment. Because you can think that there could be environmental policies that depend very heavily on technology and bypass people's participation. Or you could, as I said, you could have an approach to environment which is elitist in the sense that it's made possible by big money, expertise, labs, and those sorts of things. I mean, they're needed. I'm not saying they're not needed. But at the same time, I think both subaltern studies and postcolonial theory raise this question of making the world more participative, because what postcolonial theory was doing and the reason why it emerged in the West rather than in India or Francophone Africa initially, because this was a movement started by people who had come into the post-colonial West and were fighting new forms of racism. So the very demand of post-colonial theory was for cultural plurality, for recognition of multiple cultures. And I think that was essentially contributing to making democracies inclusive. If you think of these two dimensions, protecting the environment as well as including more people in how we care about the environment, being inclusive in our protection policy, I think both subaltern studies and postcolonial theory contributes to the second aspect more than just the environment as such. I think UNESCO's program in 1971, this program on man and biosphere or whatever it was called, was very, very forward looking. See, this was even before we had heard about global warming. Uh, this was 71, so it is quite early. It's only in 1972 that the Club of Rome report came out, right? The limits to growth. And 62 when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. So if you think about that as an early instance of environmentalism after the Second World War, then UNESCO was far ahead of many other institutions in thinking of man and biosphere as a problem when we face biodiversity loss and all that. Is what do we do with the heritage of indigenous people's practices? And how do we combine that with whatever means we have to adopt to feed, let's say, 8 billion, 9 billion people? Because, see, on the one hand, indigenous societies were usually societies that were not very crowded, which is one reason why Europeans came and took over their lands, because there are not many people to displace. I mean, they didn't do it in India or China because India or China already seemed crowded like Europe was, right? So this question is then, how do we take the traditions of these people who have managed land so well for thousands of years, but combine that with both the problems and the promises of modern agriculture? We don't not only speak of biosphere, but we actually speak of what's called the critical zone that helps life survive. So, there's the molten core of the planet, but there is like 20, 30 miles going down below the soil surface, that plus the atmosphere up to the ozone layer, because that the ozone counts in helping life live. And that's, people sometimes refer to that as the critical zone within which life survives. What I see is that many respects we have built on those ideas. The idea of biosphere, as you know, it sort of goes back to an earlier period, to Edward Swiss and then Vernadsky, the Russian scientist Vernadsky, who worked with the idea of biosphere. And we generally thought of biosphere as that part of the planet that gives rise to life. And now we realize that it's not just the soil and subsoil, it's also the air. And therefore, people call it the critical zone, which we need to protect for the sake of life. Well, how do we creatively adapt, use the heritage of indigenous peoples' land management practices? This is the question, that if in order to protect biodiversity, and we have to protect biodiversity, we have to learn from indigenous people. But thanks to all our technological advances, we now have many more humans. And poverty is another question. How to feed these people, how to manage hunger in the world, and all of, and those are two different things that we have to bring together, and it's not always easy. Whatever we do about protecting the planet, protecting the critical zone, must not be just a technoeconomic fix. Because there are many powerful societies, the US included, that have proposals on the table which are about technoeconomic fixes. And the problem with technoeconomic fixes is that powerful countries can adopt them, may be able to even impose them on the world without really fully working out how they would impact the rest of the world and other countries. And that's why I think we need participation. We need to hear more voices. We need to represent people into this program. And well, I'm not against technology. I think obviously technology helps us, but how to combine technology, how to combine market signals with the participation of people is a very delicate operation. But I think the basic value that we need to defend is the values of democracy, disagreement, dissent, freedom of expression. All of those things we need in order for debate and action to go hand in hand. Global warming affects all forms of life, not just humans. And as that crisis deepens, we realize that, and we've been realizing this for a while, that these different forms of life are interconnected. You know that in many parts of the world, bees are in decline. And many other insects are being killed by pesticides, which you need for agriculture. So what you face constantly is the contradiction of humans living well on the one hand, but putting pressure on other forms of life, on the resources of the planet on the other. If you take two sets of graphs, there's a Harvard psychologist, very well known, called Steve Pinker. And he gives all these graphs to show how, since the Great Second World War, humans have lived so well as they've never lived before, in spite of poverty, in spite of inequality. So basically, our life expectancy has gone up. Our numbers have gone up. We were 1.6 billion in 1900. In 2000, we were 6 billion. Today, we are 8, going on. So in a very short span. And why did it happen? Antibiotics, production of more food, our capacity for refrigeration. So you can move vaccinations and other medicines from one part of the world to another, right? The other side is that we're depleting the resources of the earth. And these resources contain other forms of life, which are all central to the continuation of our life, other forms of life, and of life on earth. Bill Gates has just published a book called Avoiding a Climate Disaster. It came out this year. And he thinks, by his calculation, that if we have to provide all the poor people in the world with housing, which is a good idea, then we have to build, for the next 40 years, he says, every year, a whole New York City. At the same time, I read in a scientific paper that humans are using up sand at a faster rate than the rate at which the earth produces sand. So sand is becoming a rare commodity. So, forget biodiversity, forget everything else. Here's a good idea. All the poor people should have houses. Who can argue with that? Bill Gates says, if you provide houses, it's like building a New York City every year, and we're running out of sand. That's why I think what we are facing is a civilizational crisis. It requires us to reimagine cities, reimagine housing, reimagine styles of life. See, it's from 2007 that more than 50% of humanity lives in cities. By the end of this century, we'll be an urban species. So this whole question of how do you, for instance, think of future of urbanization and the environment together. See, the environment or the earth system, whatever you want to call it, is going to be part of everything we think about. And my very good friend Pierre Charbonnier in Paris once shared this thought with me, which I thought was a revolutionary thought, and I hope that happens. And he said, Dipesh, one day we will have to teach children about the environment and ecology in the same way that we teach them numbers today. In the beginning, they didn't contribute very much because the environment was a fringe subject. There were environmentalists and there were others. In a history department, they would say, oh yeah, we have somebody who does environmental history. But now we are realizing all histories are environmental history, just as all histories are gender history. All histories are histories of life. Deep history and our shallow human history, they work together. I sometimes say to my students, how old do you think your body is? And they say, it's my age, whatever old, my age is, that's how old my body is. And then I say, okay, so how long do you think it took evolution to design that body? Millions of years. So that history of millions of years is what you actually inhabit, draw upon, make use of every time, even when you pick up a cup of tea, because these opposable fingers, that design was not born with you. That was a capacity that we have through evolution. So you are actually always making use of what evolution has made of you. And that's millions of years. So, in that sense, to give that sense to my students, for young people to have that sense, grow up with that sense that lives are connected, that what we demand as human beings has an impact on the planet, that impact might actually be, like I often say, cutting off the branch of the tree you're sitting on. So the more aware we have become of the negative impact we're having, the more we'll have to rethink what constitutes a good life for human beings. So I think that's a very interesting question, since we have two wars going on at the moment, and neither of those wars, I have to say with much regret, none of the combatants, the the planners of these wars on either side, show any explicit concern for ecology. Now, the assumption of wars have been for a long time that the earth is so big that if I light a small fire here and kill some people there, it doesn't matter for the earth. So that a war was like an act of suspending, bracketing your relationship to the earth for a while, on the assumption that our impact would not really matter to the earth and we will get the earth back. So when people say, after the war we'll build up this city, X or Y, to be a modern Singapore or something like that, it's like the assumption is that after the war we get back to the same world that we inhabited. Consider at the same time that the world is on an irreversible path of warming up. The science, some of the scientific claims just that came out the other day, they're claiming that it's actually the warming is accelerating even faster. So imagine this world that is becoming hotter, and every time I light a fire, I burn something with my bombs or my missiles. I'm only adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. There are no two ways about it. So I'm actually heating up the planet even more as I'm fighting. So the assumption that at the end of the fight I will get the same planet back doesn't hold. The planet would be worse off. So what I now think is that the more we recognize this as a reality, I'm not naive enough to think that wars will stop. I think humans will have conflicts and they'll fight. We need to change, therefore, the laws of the war, of fighting. The law says that one should not kill innocents, or particularly children, as much as possible. One should avoid doing that. They should not be the collateral damage. Countries should agree on putting a clause there saying ecological damage should be similarly protected. See, if we put in the requirement saying wars should not be allowed to commit ecological damage or cause ecological damage, we would force military experts to consider redesigning the technology for killing. I mean, obviously, I'm for peace. I think the condition for human prosperity and survival is peace. I look at my life, and I was born in India, and I've lived for more than 7 decades on this planet without seeing a major war. I mean, there was a battle between India and China, but not a major war. Not seen a bank fail in the way that banks used to fail. Seen people have good pensions, health services, welfare states, all of those. The condition for all that was peace. So I have no doubt in my head that the condition for humanity's survival and for the ecology to be protected is peace. Given that we are becoming an urban dwelling species, given that we are becoming more and more aware of ecological losses that wars cause, given that the assumption that we get the same world back doesn't hold anymore, I'm just hoping that in our own interest we'll at least be enlightened, self-interested and enlightened enough to change the game of the war, to change the rules, to make it obligatory on combating and combatant nations or groups to protect ecology, protect the environment as much as possible, both in the interest of the planet, everybody, and in their local interests, as much as possible while engaged in warfare. I often ask myself, why is it that even when the United Nations or the UNESCO describe, and scientists, IPCC, describe the climate situation as an emergency. And as you know, the United Nations General Secretary last summer described global warming as global boiling. because southern Europe was in the grip of an intense heat wave. I was in France for a little while and in Sicily, and I almost got a heat stroke in Sicily. It was just so hot. And just before then, India had passed through it, and many parts of the world did. But in spite of those things, there's a kind of sluggishness to human response to the planet question compared to wars. I mean, wars mobilize everybody in the concerned countries, and I've been wondering, why does this happen? Why don't we think that the need to decarbonize our economy by 2050 is a matter of urgency, or by 2030 is a matter of, why don't we respond to that? And then I realize that what sometimes IPCC does and scientists do is to give you average figures, like, increase of temperature compared to pre-industrial times on an average, 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5. These are average figures. Or give you a global carbon budget. You have so much carbon dioxide to send up, not more than that. And these average figures, these planetary numbers, sometimes don't speak to people. They seem too abstract. And I think that's why it's very important to combine what, as much as possible, what affects the general with what affects the local. I mean, just as there are clouds everywhere, atmosphere everywhere, the planet is everywhere. But the planet is everywhere in a local form. And that's why this translation of the local environment and its connection to the global stuff has to go on side by side. So, it's obvious when we think of Amazon forests, or the Himalayan glaciers, or the Siberian permafrost, or the North Atlantic conveyor belt that takes warm water to the northern hemisphere, right? When we know of these things as critical to the maintenance of the global climate, I think the UNESCO should include them in all world heritages. So the world heritage should not simply be what humans have made. The world heritages should include precisely those kind of spots of biospheric activity that are critical to our survival and survival of biodiversity and life and climate and those things. So on the one hand, I think, yes, people should use those statistics, the global climatic model, to designate new kind of things as world heritages. The oxygen in the atmosphere, which is very good for us, is maintained at that level, 21% or around that level, by creatures we don't think about. Phytoplanktons produce 50% of the fresh oxygen the air needs every day. And, bacteria, they do some of that work. And they've been doing it for 375 million years. So I often tell my students that, look, we are not the reason why there's oxygen in the atmosphere. It's been there at that level for almost 400 million years. We are beneficiaries of it. We use it, but there have been other forms of life come before us, alongside us. They also use it. And to know that is to know how a network of relationships are actually allowing us to survive and prosper. So that the idea that this world is made for us, as Heidegger once said, I go to a fruit-bearing tree and it is like the sap, the world is rising like the sap of the tree and greeting me as a piece of fruit. No. I mean, that fruit was being born before humans were here, right? So I think this human assumption that has informed a lot of modernization and modernity, that the world is a stage on which we act, doesn't hold anymore. That's what I was saying, that this is a stage we impact on. And if we impact badly, then the stage becomes an actor, right? And we are no longer on a stage. We are on a stage that is acting with us. And I think we need to understand that. And the UNESCO, given its roots in cultural activities, educational activities, given its mission, I see as a very, very special institution, which has a very special role to play in the current situation. And that's why it's even more urgent, desperately urgent, to spread the mission, to spread the mission of ecological awareness. And again, I come back to saying that as an educationist, as a teacher, I feel what you're doing is very important, that the classroom itself has become a site not of missionizing or activism in a street kind of activism sense, but it has become a site that it always was for raising critical awareness of the situation that humans find themselves in today.